Someone cut off mom's oxygen tube. As her personal caregiver, I didn't react at all and still sat in the corridor calmly watching TV series. In my previous life, when I heard the alarm of the medical equipment, I rushed into the ward immediately and called all the doctors on duty for emergency treatment. The operation and rescue lasted for 10 hours, and I fainted on the spot due to exhaustion. When I opened my eyes again, I was woken up by a slap from my husband. "You killed mom and you still have the nerve to sleep? You're her biological daughter. How could you do such a despicable thing?" Relatives surrounded me and beat and kicked me. "You even cut off your own mother's oxygen tube. Are you still human? You're so vicious that you'll get your comeuppance. Your mother raised you with so much hardship all by herself, and yet she raised such an ungrateful wretch. No wonder she couldn't close her eyes even when she was pushed out of the operating room." Only then did I realize that mom had died after the failed rescue. My pale attempts at defense were drowned out by the scolding of my relatives and friends, and my white protective suit was soon stained with blood from the beating. To prove my innocence, I chose to call the police. However, after the police investigation, they said that only my fingerprints were found on the scissors beside mom's pillow, and only my figure was seen entering and leaving the ward in the surveillance footage. My son even testified that I thought mom had been bedridden for too long, which was costly and laborious, and that I had been clamoring to discharge her and bury her alive every day. The relatives from my mother's side were so angry that they pushed me off the roof of the hospital. I fell and was mangled, and died on the spot. Until the moment of my death, I couldn't figure out how I, who had worked so hard for mom's hospitalization and treatment, could end up in such a situation. When I opened my eyes again, I went back to the day when the oxygen tube was cut off. "Mom, you've been here for 3 days. You must be tired. I've already finished the college entrance examination. I'm here to take your place so you can go back and rest. Hurry up and go back. I bought you the set meal from your favorite place. It's in the thermos box." Hearing my son's caring words, my eyes suddenly became red. My just adult son stood on tiptoe and looked into the ward. The vital signs on the monitor were still as weak as they were a week ago. "Has Grandma still not woken up? Don't be too sad. She'll definitely be okay. You have to take good care of yourself before she opens her eyes. Otherwise, she'll be heartbroken when she wakes up and sees you've lost weight." My son was as sensible as he was in my previous life, but it made me shiver all over. Since mom was hospitalized due to a critical illness a year ago, the time he spent in the hospital was almost as long as the time he spent studying in the classroom. The whole inpatient department praised me for having such a good son. My husband had never been short of funds for mom's hospitalization. To let me rest, he hired 2 professional caregivers at a high cost. I was afraid that they wouldn't take good care of mom, so I insisted on taking care of her myself. In this way, our family became an example for the whole inpatient department. If it hadn't been for my husband and son turning against me at the same time in my previous life and accusing me of being completely heartless and inhumane at the door of the operating room, I would never have thought that the family members I had loved and cared for 20 years could have such a crazy side. Seeing that I was in a daze, my son reached out and put his arm around my shoulders. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you too tired? I've already finished the exam. I can share the burden for you. Don't worry and go back to rest." I took a deep breath and waved my hand tremblingly. I turned my head to look at the figure on the hospital bed. Tears couldn't help blurring my vision. It was on this day that mom, who had been treated for a year, left me forever. When I was woken up by a slap from my husband Frank at the door of the operating room, all I heard was the news of her death. Without thinking much, the grief of mom's death made me burst into uncontrollable sobs on the spot. My usually sensible son, however, had a sarcastic look on his face and told me not to cry at the door of the operating room, lest I make Grandma die with her eyes open. Under my puzzled gaze, Frank said that I was the one who cut off mom's oxygen tube with my own hands. He shouted with tears streaming down his face and saliva flying everywhere. "You don't even spare your own mother. Are you still human? After 20 years of marriage, I really didn't expect you to be such a heartless beast. When our son reminded me that you were abusing mom, I didn't believe it. I didn't expect that you'd go too far and kill her directly today. Isn't it just that taking care of her and paying for the treatment took up some of your time? If you thought it was tiring, you could have said so. Why did you have to lay hands on your own mother? Before I could explain, the relatives who came to see Mom for the last time surrounded me. My explanations were drowned out by the curses of the crowd that I didn't even get to see Mom for the last time. The moment before I was dragged out of the hospital by the security guards, I chose to call the police. However, when the police investigation ended and the results were announced publicly, they said that only my fingerprints were found on the scissors beside Mom's pillow, and only my figure was seen entering and leaving the ward in the corridor surveillance. Instantly, the scolding that had just subsided was stirred up again. Even more vicious voices overwhelmed me. Fanny's father passed away early. Her mother raised her daughter with decades of hardship all by herself. Unexpectedly, she raised such an ungrateful wretch. They say that there are no filial children beside a sickbed for a long time. Today I've really seen it. When she was at school, her mother had to beg many families to scrape together enough tuition fees for her. She's really unworthy of being a daughter. It's better that she's dead. She's free now. If I had such a daughter, I'd come back as a ghost to claim her life even after I died. How dare you call the police? Do you really think that God is blind? You even killed your own mother. Aren't you afraid of being struck by lightning when you go out? These relatives who watched me grow up now looked at me with eyes that seemed to want to tear me apart on the spot. The wreaths I ordered were sent to the hospital. Before they even warmed up, they were smashed onto my head. Blood flowed all over my face, and they cursed even more vigorously. The patients in the hospital also came out to watch the fun and immediately joined in when they heard the cause. They dug out the used and discarded syringes from the trash can and threw them at me. They forced me all the way to the roof of the hospital. The moment before I fell from the roof, I was still explaining and apologizing. But they thought I was just making excuses and pushed even harder. I was pushed off the roof and fell, mangled and bleeding. I couldn't figure it out even until the moment I died. Why did I work so hard for Mom's hospitalization and treatment, yet ended up in such a situation in the end? This time, I must find out the truth. Wiping away my tears, I tentatively asked, "What's your dad busy with today?" "You've just finished the exam. Won't he take you out to relax?" A hint of hesitation flashed in my son Leo's eyes. "It seems that there's something going on in the company. Besides, Grandma is seriously ill. How can I be in the mood to go out and relax? I'd rather take advantage of the holiday to share the burden for you." There was nothing abnormal in his words. Every line was filled with his love and concern for me. I pretended to be sad and asked again, "I've been taking care of Grandma for a year, but she still hasn't woken up. Am I so useless?" He quickly stepped forward and hugged me, patting my shoulder comfortingly. "You've already done a great job. Grandma will be proud of you." 2 more tears fell, and Leo gently wiped them away. I looked at the figure on the hospital bed who was so emaciated that she hardly looked like herself and murmured, "If Grandma leaves, will you blame me? I've wasted so much time in the hospital, but got nothing in return." Leo let out a long sigh and tucked the hair beside my ear behind my ear. "How could we blame you? I know you're the one who will be the saddest when Grandma leaves. I only blame myself for being useless and not being able to share all this for you. I've already decided that once my grades come out, I'll apply for the medical major." Just then, a message notification sound rang on my phone. It was from Frank. "Honey, don't be too tired. There's still a long way to go. Let our son take your place for a few days. You should go home and rest quickly. I've already tidied up the house. I've also signed up our son for a summer vacation tour group. If you're worried about Mom, I'll stay in the hospital with you." The continuous care from the father and son made my eyes turn red. Seeing that I didn't say anything, my son got a bit worried. "Mom, look at the bloodshot eyes you have. You should go back and rest quickly. I'll just stay here and watch over Grandma. Call the doctor immediately if anything happens." After leaving the corridor under my son's gaze, I turned back and crouched in the corner of the corridor to monitor his every move. Time passed by minute. However, He just sat on the chair all the time and didn't move at all. When Mom's attending doctor passed by, I finally couldn't help but grab her. "Dr. Candy, how's my mom's condition exactly? It's been a year. Could you please give me a hint? So that I can have an idea and make some preparations in advance?" She glanced at me and said inexplicably, "What preparations?" "The patient has been recovering slowly. Barring any accidents, she should be able to be transferred to a general ward soon." I was stunned for a moment. "She's been recovering all along? Then if the medical equipment accidentally loses power or something now, will something happen to my mom?" She thought for 2 seconds and shook her head. "Most likely not. And we have people on duty all the time. We won't allow this kind of situation to happen." I rolled my eyes and took out a red envelope from my pocket and stuffed it into her pocket. "Thank you, Dr. Candy, for taking care of my mom this year. I'm really grateful. I'll definitely send you a silk banner when Mom is discharged from the hospital." Who would have thought that she immediately changed her face when she saw the red envelope? "Miss Fanny, this is what we doctors should do. Please don't insult my profession." She threw the red envelope back into my hand and left without looking back. In my previous life, she was always in charge of my mother's treatment, and she was also the one who performed the operation after the oxygen tube was cut off. If everything that happened had nothing to do with her, then who else could it be? The uneasiness in my heart grew heavier and heavier. I stared fixedly at the door of my mother's ward. The thought that half an hour later, my mother's oxygen tube would be cut off and she would die after the rescue failed made me so anxious that I could hardly breathe. But until now, there hadn't been any clues yet. I carefully recalled everything that had happened in my previous life and thought about all the details. I paced back and forth in the corridor for more than 10 minutes. Suddenly, an idea flashed through my mind. I quickly turned around and went downstairs to the monitoring room of the inpatient department. I watched the surveillance footage of the corridor outside the ward door within a week over and over again 3 times. My heart grew colder and colder. 5 minutes before the oxygen tube was cut off, I adjusted the surveillance time to the day when my mother was just hospitalized a year ago. Looking at the picture on the screen, my hanging heart died completely at this moment. After walking out of the monitoring room and returning to the door of the ward, my son was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was a group of relatives who had rushed here from my hometown. They were crying their hearts out while lying on the window of the ward. The alarm of the medical equipment was sharp and piercing. They didn't understand the procedures in the hospital and were as anxious as ants on a hot pan at this moment. They were grabbing people everywhere and asking where the doctors on duty were. I wiped my face, swept away the gloom just now, and calmly sat on the chair in the corridor beside me and opened my phone to watch TV series. Until Frank rushed over in a hurry, slid and knelt down at the door of the ward. He was crying with snot and tears all over his face, shouting, "Mom! I'm too late. You can rest assured and go. I'll definitely deal with Fanny, this unfilial daughter, for you. She dared to cut your oxygen tube today. I'll dare to send her to prison tomorrow. Such a heartless thing will surely get her comeuppance." I peeked out from the corner. His eyes were bloodshot with anger, and the veins on his neck were bulging. There was no trace of his usual gentleness left. With his assertive judgment, those relatives were instantly enraged. Before they could lose their temper, someone behind me grabbed me by the collar and dragged me in front of everyone. Suddenly, the hand loosened its grip, and I was thrown heavily to the ground. "Mom, you even killed Grandma. How dare you hide? How could I have a mother like you? You used to say every day that Grandma was a burden. I thought you were just joking. I didn't expect that you could even cut off the oxygen tube. Are you out of your mind? How can you live up to Grandma's decades of nurturing? Do you even deserve to be called a human being?" In just half an hour, Leo was already looking at me with intense hatred in his eyes. First, my husband accused me, and then my son turned against me. They completely nailed me to the pillar of shame for my sins. The alarm sound of the medical equipment in the ward grew weaker and weaker until it finally stopped completely. At the moment when Mother passed away, I let out a long breath, as if I had shed all the heavy burdens and smiled easily. I spread my hands innocently on both sides and said softly, "Everyone has their own destiny. Today, so many of you came but couldn't save my mother. What could I do? Besides, I just showed up. How could you blame me for this? I've taken care of her for a year. I've already done my best. Whether she lives or dies is her fate. Since they wanted to be heartless first, then don't blame me for being ruthless now." Hearing my words, the relatives whom I hadn't seen for years immediately became furious. Frank was helped up by our son and quickly walked up to me. He raised his hand and slapped me hard across the face. "Fanny, is this what a biological daughter should say? Don't mention taking care of her for a year. Even if you took care of her for 10 years, it would still be your duty. The one lying in there is your biological mother. Has your conscience been eaten by dogs? Mom raised you with so much hardship all by herself. How can you live up to her?" A group of people gradually approached me, and the vicious curses bent my spine. In my previous life, they forced me onto the roof step by step like this and pushed me off the building, causing me to die a horrible death. Thinking of this, I couldn't stop trembling all over, and hatred surged in my chest. Seeing that I was indignant, Leo kicked me on the thigh, forcing me to kneel down on the spot. "What's your attitude? You killed Grandma and now you still have the nerve to talk back to us. Do you think we can't do anything to you? I'm telling you, I've recorded all the crazy things you said before." After saying that, he took out his phone, and the scene playing on it was actually from Mother's ward. I was looking at Mother's sick body with resentment in my eyes. "Why don't you die yet? I still have my own life. How long are you going to drag me down? I've done my best after taking care of you for a year. If you don't wake up, don't blame me for taking matters into my own hands." After the video finished playing, the relatives were so angry that they couldn't even curse. Several elderly ones fainted on the spot and were sent to the emergency room. The younger ones directly grabbed my clothes and threatened to send me to the police station. Frank and his son smiled smugly when they saw this. My eyes grew colder and colder. "If you do this, you'll regret it when the truth comes out." "Regret? Save that for when you're in prison." Leo kicked me in the waist again. I staggered and barely managed to steady myself. Tears welled up in my eyes. The sharp pain in my bones was less hurtful than the disappointment in my heart. Looking at my son who had turned against me, my eyes almost bled with tears. At the moment when the relatives' hands were about to touch me, the police finally arrived at the scene. "Comrade Police! Hurry! This is the murderer. Take her away quickly. The one who died inside is her biological mother. She cut the oxygen tube with her own hands. This is murder and she must be severely punished. She must be executed by shooting. Otherwise, her mother will die with her eyes open." I was so angry at the relatives' words that I laughed out loud. "The police haven't examined it yet. How do you know how she died? Can you predict the future? Shouldn't we listen to what the police say about the cause of death?" A hint of hatred flashed in Frank's eyes, and he immediately took a step back to make way for the door of the ward. "Comrade Police, you can investigate right now. From the beginning to the end, only she entered and left the whole ward. If it's not her who killed Mom, I'll die in front of you. If it turns out that the murderer is Fanny, please take her to be sentenced to death immediately. Let my mother rest in peace." I sneered and patted off the dirt left by Leo's shoe just now. "Do an autopsy. I have no objection. Just be prepared to die." As soon as I said this, the relatives at the scene immediately gasped. Immediately after that, even harsher and shriller curses swept towards me. "She's crazy. This woman has gone mad. Poor Fanny's father's family. Her biological mother is already dead, and now she won't even leave her body intact and wants to do an autopsy. Is this something a biological daughter would do? Why couldn't we see that she was such a lunatic before? She looks like a normal person, but the things she does are more disgusting one after another." A look of panic flashed in the eyes of Frank and his son, and their gazes met in the air. Then they sternly questioned me. "Mom has already passed away. Can't you even let her go in peace? Who said that the police must do an autopsy to investigate the cause of death? The cause of Mom's death is already very clear. The oxygen tube you cut off is still dragging on the ground. You can still argue in front of her body. You're really out of your mind. The scissors could be placed directly beside the pillow. I'm afraid that if the oxygen tube hadn't been cut short, it would be Mom's throat that was cut in the end. Just look at the surveillance and the physical evidence for the investigation. All the relatives in the family are here. I don't think you dare to lay a finger on Mom. Frank's eyes were sharp, and his shouting almost echoed throughout the inpatient department. After he said that, the relatives immediately echoed. Yeah. It's already infuriating that she was killed by her own daughter. Now that she's dead, she's still going to be autopsied. Is she even human? Why should there be an autopsy when the police haven't even said so? What a thing. A murderer really thinks she's something. Leo was tapping on the mobile phone that I bought for him with my salary. Without even looking up, he said, I don't have such a mother. I don't recognize her. From now on, I only have my dad. He feigned filial piety and won the tears of many relatives. Just as the police were about to enter the ward to investigate, Dr. Candy came over after hearing the noise and was startled by the scene in front of her. What's going on? Why are you all crowded here? What happened? Why are the police here? Don't make trouble in the hospital. If you want to make trouble, go outside. Catching sight of her usual fare and just look, a sense of sarcasm filled my chest. So I simply folded my arms across my chest and watched them put on their act together. Frank, however, seemed to see a savior in the apocalypse. He rushed over and grabbed Dr. Candy's white coat. Dr. Candy, you're finally here. Please explain to the police quickly and take them to check the surveillance. Prove my mother's innocence. He was crying bitterly while calling her Mom one after another. People who didn't know would think that the person who had just passed away inside was his biological mother. The relatives also completely forgot the fact that I was the daughter of the deceased. At this moment, following this outsider, they all wished they could sentence me to death on the spot. Dr. Candy pretended to be hesitant and negotiated with the police for a while. Finally, she said in public, "Excuse me. The hospital has its own regulations. Outsiders indeed can't enter at will. I'll go and check the cause of the deceased's death now and then come out to discuss with the police. Everyone, please calm down." After saying that, she turned around and entered the ward with a police officer, closed the door, and isolated us all outside. The broken oxygen mask was held in her hand. After a year, I finally saw clearly the face on the hospital bed. Hatred surged in my heart, and I couldn't stop trembling. Frank thought that I hadn't discovered the truth and was still acting in front of the relatives. Poor Mom lost her husband when she was young. She raised her daughter with so much hardship all by herself. Finally, when she got her daughter married, she didn't even enjoy a happy life before leaving like this. I still remember on the day of our wedding, she said that from then on, I would be her biological son and she would be my biological mother. To support us, she never stopped working for a day. Every month, part of her salary had to be handed over to Fanny. I persuaded her countless times that it was Mom's pension money and we couldn't take it, but she even got angry with me on the spot. After 20 years of marriage, I thought she would gradually change. But in the end, Mom is still gone. It's all my fault. It's because I was soft-hearted that I killed Mom. I should have told you all earlier. My son was getting tissues for his father and couldn't help but have his eyes turn red when he heard this. I heard that the down payment for the house we're living in now was also paid by Grandma. When I was a child, it was Grandma who raised me. Today, I must seek justice for her. Hearing their heartfelt words, the relatives' hatred for me grew even deeper. My sister who grew up with me reached out and pinched my arm hard. The pain made my face turn pale, but I gritted my teeth and didn't say a word. I stared fixedly at everything in the ward, watching their so-called investigation. The technicians of the police sent the cut oxygen tube for inspection. As expected, only my fingerprints were found on it again. When Candy and the police came out, the relatives swarmed up and surrounded the two of them. They asked about the cause of my mother's death and the investigation situation in a hubbub. They even wanted to send me to prison before the test results came out. They wanted to execute me before my mother's funeral. If it were in the past, seeing so many relatives caring about my mother, I would have been deeply moved and burst into tears. But now, I just found it ironic. When they were tired of asking questions and the police maintained order, I sneered and said, "Who would have thought that you all had such deep feelings for my mother? Then why didn't any of you come to visit her during the year when she was hospitalized? I didn't even have anyone to replace me. Where were you all at that time? Don't tell me you didn't know." Mom had been alone in our hometown for so many years. If any of you had gone to visit her, this wouldn't have happened today. Have you had enough of acting? If so, get out. I gradually lost control of my emotions and shouted at them excitedly. As soon as I finished speaking, Frank slapped me across the face. The successive slaps made my cheeks swell and turn red rapidly. The burning heat seemed to rush straight to the top of my head. I covered my numb and dizzy head and looked at his smug face with bloodshot eyes. "You're just a murderer. What right do you have to shout at them? Are you worthy? Once the police investigation results come out, I'll send you to prison immediately." I hadn't drunk any water for a long time, and my body didn't have any extra strength to resist. The hand holding the mobile phone tightened more and more, and my fingernails dug deeply into my palm. When I turned around to go to the bathroom, my wrist was suddenly grabbed. "Where do you think you're going? You're not going anywhere now." My son trapped me in place without asking why. His ferocious look made me vaguely recall when he was a child. Once, when I had an argument with Frank and Frank wanted to lay hands on me, he could hardly walk steadily, but still staggered to protect me. He shouted at his drunk father with his childish voice, "Don't touch my mom. You're a bad guy. Bad guy." The Ultraman toy that I bought for him, he never wanted to play with it much. But on that day, he could take it out as a weapon and hit Frank with it. He had the same expression on his face back then. Unfortunately, it was no longer to protect me. Later, I don't know when it started, but he became more and more estranged from me. He got closer and closer to Frank. After my mother was hospitalized, their secret activities became more and more frequent. I thought that Frank had found some famous teacher's sprint class for our son, and I didn't think much about it. But now it seems that the truth was far from what I thought. The disappointment of being betrayed almost drowned my rationality. At this moment, looking at my son's face that was the same as before, I couldn't feel any love in my heart. I had never imagined that there would be a day when I would turn against my biological son. "What are you looking at? It's useless to look at me. Grandma was so kind to me. I must avenge Grandma with my dad. I was really blind before to think that you were a good mother." I silently withdrew my gaze and shook off his wrist that was restraining me. "I'm just going to the bathroom. I won't run away. You don't need to watch me like I'm a prisoner." Hearing my words, he didn't push his luck anymore, but his resentful gaze made my back feel cold all over. Gradually, the praises of relatives and friends came to my ears. "Fortunately, you're not like your mother. What a good boy. It's worth your grandmother loving you so much when she was alive. It seems that you take after Frank. You don't even look like Fanny. Since the child is so upright, your grandmother can rest in peace in heaven." A sarcastic smile curled up at the corners of my lips. I walked to the sink and splashed cold water on my face several times until the burning sensation on my face subsided a little and I finally sobered up. 2 minutes later, my son's phone rang. "Where are you? You haven't come out yet? I'm telling you that there are police officers downstairs. Don't even think about running away. I'll wait for you right at the door. I'll give you 5 minutes. Don't try any tricks." Taking a deep breath, I turned off my phone and walked out. Sure enough, he was waiting right at the door. When he saw me, he immediately followed me closely. He was so afraid that I would leave his sight for even a second that he was watching me even more closely than the police. On the way back to the ward, I couldn't help but ask, "Leo, Mom has raised you for so many years. Will you regret treating me like this today?" Perhaps because I had raised him for 18 years, I still felt a bit reluctant to part with this son in my heart. Dr. Candy was already surrounded by relatives, who kept, "Shut up. I've said that I don't have a mother as crazy as you. After saying that, after turning the last corner, we walked onto the corridor in front of the ward. Dr. Candy was already surrounded by relatives, who kept asking about my mother's physical condition over the past year. I knew what their purpose was. They just wanted Dr. Candy to say more words that were unfavorable to me in front of the police as evidence, so that I could be sentenced to a longer prison term. When Frank saw me appear, he quickly pulled away the excited relatives. He couldn't wait to say, "Quickly cover my mother and send her to be cremated. Let her rest in peace as soon as possible. Since things have come to this, we can only seek justice for her." I took a step forward and blocked everyone's way, blocking the entrance to the ward. "I'm standing right here. I'd like to see who dares to do it." Candy immediately darkened her face, with an unprecedentedly cold expression. "Miss Fanny, I know you can't accept this bad news in a short time, but you can't just enter as you please. She's already gone. Don't make a fuss. If you can't calm down, I'll have to call the hospital security guards up here." I was so angry at her bossy look that I laughed out loud. "Since when has it been up to you in the hospital? The police are here. What right do you have to take me away? I said that my mother's body can't be cremated if I don't agree." "What? You just kept saying that I'm her biological daughter, and now you don't recognize me?" Without the nod of her biological daughter, I'd like to see who dares to cremate her. Or are you afraid that if the cremation is postponed for a day, the real cause of her death will be exposed? Frank and his son both turned pale at the same time. Frank pulled my arm hard and dragged me aside. He pulled so hard that I could even hear the sound of bones dislocating. He actually dislocated my shoulder by force. Cold sweat due to the sharp pain dripped down my forehead. I gritted my teeth and glared at him angrily. "What are you doing? The one who died inside is my mother. It's none of your business. You're just a son-in-law. Why are you in such a hurry? Do you have any right to be in a hurry? Or is there any benefit for you in my mother's death?" The relatives were enraged by my attitude and all wanted to come forward to argue with me. The atmosphere at the scene was instantly ignited. Just when it was about to get out of control, the police officer in charge received a phone call and quickly came forward to take me out. "Wait. The test results of the oxygen tube are out. Everyone calm down. If the family members of the deceased don't agree to the cremation, just leave it for now. The suspect has to come with us to the police station to assist in the investigation." I thought that no one would object to what the police said. But the next second, Frank knelt down on the spot. He was crying with snot and tears all over his face. "My mother has worked hard all her life. Can't you just let me send her off first? The test results are already out. Why do you still make her wait? You're the police. How can you shield this crazy woman?" Then, he tugged at Leo's sleeve. Leo then also knelt down beside him. "Uncle Police, I'm her biological grandson. I really can't bear to see my grandmother lying here alone. She has already lived like this for a year. Now that she's passed away, do you still want to make her suffer like this?" The relatives were moved by the two of them. They contacted the funeral parlor and the venue for the funeral. Finally, after arranging everything, they said anxiously, "We've come all this way just to see her for the last time. Since we can't see her anymore, let's attend the funeral early and go back early. Otherwise, there's no place for such a large group of people to stay." Voices of agreement came one after another. Even Candy came forward to explain that the hospital had its own regulations. In case I couldn't come back after going to the police station to assist in the investigation, the hospital couldn't keep watching over the body for me all the time. They didn't have such an obligation. The police were eager to handle the case. They frowned and looked at me, asking for my opinion. In the eyes of everyone, I held my mobile phone and turned around to walk towards the end of the corridor. After making a phone call, I came back and agreed to the request to bury my mother first. But there was only one condition. She couldn't be cremated, and I had to plan the whole process. Frank was so angry that he was about to lose his temper, but was held back by Candy. She said that as long as I was willing to bury her, everything else didn't matter. Looking at their actions, the corners of my lips curled up with a disdainful arc. The relatives and friends all breathed a sigh of relief when they heard this. I started to look for a place to stay for the night. Leo volunteered to book rooms for the relatives online. Just as the police were about to take me away to the police station for investigation, when we walked downstairs, I stopped in my tracks. The funeral is arranged for tomorrow. Let's conduct the investigation together tomorrow. I'll give everyone a satisfactory answer. They looked at each other in dismay. After a long stalemate, in the end, they helplessly assigned someone to follow me. That person watched me busy myself with the funeral arrangements. I didn't close my eyes until early morning. He was a bit puzzled. Were you really the one who killed her? Seeing how carefully you're preparing for the funeral, I really can't figure out why you would do such a thing. I shook my head feebly. My throat was so dry and hoarse that I could hardly make a sound. While staring at the curses and bad reputations I was facing online on my mobile phone screen, I said slowly, I've never admitted that I killed anyone. By the way, are you sure there are people on duty guarding the door of the ward? After hearing an affirmative reply, I couldn't hold on any longer and fell sound asleep. At 5 o'clock the next morning, the people I contacted had already arrived. Mom's body was carried into the ice coffin and sent to the funeral site. The relatives were crying their hearts out in front of the coffin, with tears streaming down their faces. One after another, they talked about the past events, and every word was filled with their reluctance to part with Mom. Everywhere my eyes landed was the sorrowful white color. Wreaths filled every corner of the site. It wasn't until the last step of the process that the extremely angry voices of Frank and his son came from outside the door. Fanny, you bitch. The body is still in the hospital. How could you hold a funeral like this? I knew you were up to something. They rushed in recklessly and smashed quite a few obstructive wreaths. The police officer following me suddenly changed his expression. Only then did he call his colleague on duty at the door of the ward. Soon, he got the answer. The body that died from the cut oxygen tube was still in the ward. It wasn't the same one as the one in the coffin now. Hearing the reply from the walkie-talkie, the relatives' expressions changed instantly. Grief was replaced by anger, and they lost control of their emotions and wanted to rush up and tear me apart. The police immediately called in their colleagues, but it was too late. The relatives surrounded me and took the wreaths they had sent and smashed them hard on top of my head. The offerings on the table were scattered all over the floor. The white candles were broken into 3 pieces. At the last moment, I still didn't show any expression. Calmly, I took out the microphone that I had prepared long ago from my pocket. I didn't mean to play tricks. The body is indeed in the ward, and I'm indeed holding a funeral for my mom today. But when did I say that the person in the ward was my biological mother? As soon as these words came out, the noisy sounds at the scene suddenly disappeared. Frank's eyes were bloodshot. He wanted to step forward and snatch my microphone, but was controlled by the police and pinned to the ground. Leo wanted to lay hands on me, but I slapped him several times in a row. Looking at his face, my gaze was colder than ever before. Son, this is the last time I'll call you that. After today, you'll have nothing to do with me. Frank was afraid that I would let the cat out of the bag and started shouting at me, Fanny, you're crazy. You're a lunatic. I shouldn't have been soft-hearted towards you yesterday. Bitch. You're a bitch. The more intensely he cursed, the more flamboyantly I laughed. Tears fell from the corners of my eyes. I had completely ruined the past 20 years of my youth. Frank, who's the crazy one among us? We've been married for so long, but you've never taken me to see your mother. You said you were an orphan, that both your parents were dead, and that my mother was your mother and you would be as filial to her as if she were your biological mother. But what have you done now? A year ago, you brought your mother to the hospital, buried my mother's body casually at the entrance, lied to me that my mother was critically ill, and made me take care of her closely for a year. I wasn't allowed to enter freely. In the end, I didn't even get to take a look inside. You really deceived me so badly. If I hadn't asked someone to dig at the entrance of my hometown, I'm afraid I would have been kept in the dark for the rest of my life. Mourning for your mother while ignoring mine. In an instant, the relatives looked at each other in horror. Frank didn't expect that I would say these things in public. He was both shocked and frightened. After a while, he shouted, "Shut up. What nonsense are you talking about? The one who died was your mother. Everyone saw it. Don't slander me here." I smiled and clicked on my mobile phone that had been connected to the screen long ago. I played the video copied from the hospital's monitoring room. When he sent someone to the hospital a year ago, that person hadn't become so emaciated that it was still barely possible to recognize the facial features. It could be clearly seen that the face in the surveillance video wasn't my mother's at all. But he told the medical staff my mother's name. An operation was carried out on the same night after registration, and the person was directly sent in. When I received his call and rushed there, I already didn't have a chance to take a look at the patient. I just believed his words when he said something had happened to my mother. In order to take better care of my mother, I quit my job. I started living in the hospital corridor day and night. I thought that my mother would gradually get out of danger and wake up. But I didn't expect that she would sleep like that for a whole year. In the end, she died from the cut oxygen tube and lack of oxygen and suffocation. Hearing the truth, the relatives became cautious this time and didn't dare to believe it casually. Frank still wanted to argue. But I shut him up with just one sentence. The body in the ward hasn't decomposed yet. I can do a paternity test. Do you, Daddy? Thinking your own mother was a burden, wanting to destroy the body to cover up the truth, and finally framing me for it. Frank, you really had a good plan. Hearing my questioning, my son swayed a couple of times and could hardly stand on his feet. Finally, he slowly turned his head, and his eyes looking at Frank were full of disappointment. Dad, that's not what you told me. Were you lying to me? Frank didn't have time to explain and just said hatefully, "So what if everything you said is true? The fact is that only your fingerprints were found on the scissors. You're the murderer. Only my fingerprints on the scissors? Of course it's because the scissors were taken from home. They were the things I used for work, so of course only I had touched them. But I didn't even enter the ward once. How could I have tampered with the oxygen tube? I have to say that your lover is as bold as you are. If I'm not mistaken, Candy is already pregnant, right? Is this also one of the means you used to threaten my son?" Once wearing the protective suit and my shoes, it's impossible to distinguish the identity from the surveillance. You were really careful enough. After saying that, the police rushed forward and took Frank into custody. Leo immediately knelt in front of me and slapped himself hard in the face. "Mom, I'm sorry. It's all my fault. I shouldn't have believed him. He said you were a murderer and asked me to protect my little brother, so I was so bewitched. Please forgive me. I didn't know what kind of mood I should be in to face him." After hesitating for a long time, I couldn't bring myself to say, "It's okay." With my testimony, the police compared my hair with the body in the ward, and it turned out that there was indeed no blood relationship. The truth was completely revealed. After I finished my mother's funeral and buried her, I rushed to the police station to make the last record. There, I saw Candy. She had already been fired by the hospital. I heard from the police that it was inevitable for them to go to prison. Due to the great pressure of public opinion, they probably wouldn't be sentenced lightly. I just nodded and used the printer in the police station to print a divorce agreement. Fortunately, Frank signed it readily this time. Probably he had endured me for a long time and didn't want to have anything to do with me anymore. On the day they went to prison, Leo left home at the same time. He said that he would work to earn tuition fees. He didn't have the face to take my money anymore. I didn't stop him. I was busy replying to the apology messages from relatives. This incident would be like a thorn stuck in everyone's heart for a long time. I was also too lazy to maintain these useless relationships anymore. If something isn't meant to be mine, no matter how hard I try, I can't keep it. After the turmoil passed, I sold the house in my hometown. I found a new job. Heaven gave me another chance, and this time I just wanted to live for myself. The end.